On July 16, 1945, the world's first nuclear weapons test was conducted in New Mexico. It was the scientific culmination of the Manhattan Project, America's nationwide effort to build nuclear weapons during World War II. It was an incredible story. At the heart of the project was Los Alamos. Los Alamos was the design laboratory of the Manhattan Project and was responsible for designing, building, testing, and helping to deliver the nuclear weapons in combat. Scientists from around the world gathered at Los Alamos to help in this effort. They included many Nobel laureates, including Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Emilio Segre.
Because of the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany, many of the scientists started to immigrate to the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada. Many of those scientists were selected to be part of the Manhattan Project to help this challenging problem of developing the first atomic bomb.
The largest group of foreign-born scientists came from the United Kingdom. Collectively known as the British Mission, they were led by Sir James Chadwick, himself a Nobel laureate, and made a significant contribution to the work of wartime Los Alamos.
The Manhattan Project benefited tremendously from some great minds coming from Europe. We had notable scientists from Hungary, von Neumann, Szilard, Ulam. They contributed in remarkable ways to the project. The British mission itself had a number of scientists who started their careers in Germany. They began their research at the location where modern science began, where quantum mechanics was born. But they had emigrated to Britain in the 30s to avoid Nazism. In fact, during the Manhattan Project, the American scientists would say that you could tell who the British ones were because they were the ones speaking with German accents.
Long before the British scientists arrived in Los Alamos, Albert Einstein sent a letter to President Roosevelt warning him of the military potential of fission. This letter is often regarded as the catalyst for the beginning of the Manhattan Project, but it wasn't.
Three physicists, Eugene Wigner, Leo Szilard, and Edward Teller, decided that they needed to get the president's attention focused on the atomic bomb, and they did so by using Einstein. And so those three wrote a letter, drafted a letter, which Einstein signed and was transmitted to Roosevelt. And this prompted funding to start ramping up for atomic bomb work. It didn't create the Manhattan Project, but it certainly boosted the atomic research. And the upshot of the letter was that funding increased for such experiments as Fermi's famous reactor experiments at Chicago later on.
The British didn't know anything about Einstein's letter at the time, but they shared his concern that an atomic bomb might be possible. It's just nobody had a clear idea how to do it at that point. And so the letter really didn't light the fuse under the Manhattan Project. It wasn't even delivered to the president for 6 weeks, and it didn't lead to immediate decisive action.
Einstein's letter did lead to federal funding for nuclear research, and American scientists did recognize that it might be possible to harness fission in the form of some type of bomb. However, early concepts for nuclear weapons in the United States were not practical. They certainly were not transformative. And so American scientists focused more on developing reactors for the production of electricity. In early 1940, two refugee scientists, a German, Rudolf Peierls, and an Austrian, Otto Frisch, informed the British government of fission's potential for a military weapon.
The Frisch-Peierls memo has a tremendous importance historically. Peierls and Frisch were two physicists working in Britain, and because they hadn't yet obtained British citizenship, they were kept away from important things like radar and asked to work on the nuclear physics, which was viewed to be less likely to be important in the war effort. But they made a tremendously important breakthrough. In principle, it was possible to make a nuclear bomb out of the 235 uranium isotope. That memo that led to the Maud memorandum that then got Britain and America moving seriously towards building a bomb.
In response, the British government formed the Maud Committee to explore the Frisch-Peierls proposal. As the British worked toward a formal report, they began sharing information with their American counterparts. They hoped that the Americans would recognize the peril of a Nazi nuclear monopoly and join the war on Britain's side. The Maud Committee's final report, completed in the summer of 1941, predicted that a nuclear weapon could be completed by the end of 1943. Such a weapon was likely to lead to decisive results in the war.
The Maud Committee was made up of leading British physicists, but also a couple of Americans, Ken Bainbridge from Harvard and Charles Lauritsen from Caltech. They both attended Maud Committee meetings. 2 reports got written, one on the potential for an atomic bomb and the other on the potential for civil nuclear energy. And that was enough to convince Winston Churchill. Churchill loved a secret weapon. And so in October 1941, Britain became the first country in the world to have a nuclear weapons program. And after some energetic prompting from Ernest Lawrence and his Australian friend Mark Oliphant, the Maud reports and the fact the British government was serious about nuclear weapons convinced the US government that something had to be done.
As a result, research in the United States shifted from nuclear reactors to nuclear bombs.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America was now at war. The United States faced enemies on many fronts. As they did, nuclear weapons research continued in the United States. The Manhattan Project was finally established in August 1942, and it caught and surpassed its UK counterpart very quickly. Now with a clear lead, the United States stopped sharing information with the British. Some American officials feared that the British would exploit nuclear advances in the United States for post-war commercial gain. This understandably agitated the British, who had played a central role in helping the Americans recognize the atom's full potential in the first place.
By 1943, the United States had the organization and funding in place for a huge industrial atomic program, but British progress had effectively stalled. Realistically, working with the US was now the only option, and it was a shame it took a while for that reality to sink in for the British.
The reality for the British was clear. If they continued to maintain an independent nuclear weapons program, they would only fall further and further behind the United States. A partnership was needed. In the summer of 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally negotiated an accord to bring the US and UK programs together. Known as the Quebec Agreement, the Quebec Agreement codified this arrangement. The two countries would resume sharing classified nuclear weapons information, and they agreed that they would consult each other if nuclear weapons were used against a third party.
This was a vital agreement for the British because it paved the way for a close involvement in the atomic project. Allied leaders were at Quebec to plan the conduct of the war as a whole, and President Roosevelt's main aim was actually to get Churchill to commit on the record in front of the combined chiefs of staff to a second front in Europe in summer of 1944. So when he got that commitment and a private promise that an American general could lead that operation, well, Roosevelt could afford to be generous over atomic energy.
Churchill also conceded that the British would not pursue post-war commercial interests in nuclear energy without the consent of the President of the United States. The U.S. would host the combined effort. America was far from the fighting, had unmatched resources, and was already ahead in nuclear research. The UK was now an exclusive partner, but a junior one. As such, British scientists immediately began coming to existing Manhattan Project facilities. The largest group came to Los Alamos under the leadership of Sir James Chadwick.
The discovery of the neutron by Sir James Chadwick is arguably one of the most important discoveries in nuclear science. Chadwick's discovery allowed atomic bombs to be made.
James Chadwick brought tremendous gravitas to the Los Alamos project, to the Manhattan Project, and to Britain's contribution. He was greatly respected by the American scientists. He himself didn't spend much time in Los Alamos. Most of his time was in Washington, D.C. He was a great administrator. He was working to make sure that the British-American relationship was going as smoothly as possible for the success of the project. One thing that I think is quite interesting about Chadwick is that he had developed a very positive, very strong relationship with both Groves and Oppenheimer. Groves saw him as somebody very committed to building the project to end the war. Oppenheimer saw Chadwick as somebody who had a different perspective to him. Oppenheimer was a theoretical physicist, often jumping to conclusions about what the correct technical answer would be. Chadwick would often challenge him, requesting and pointing to the importance of experimental evidence, of empirical checks. And Groves really resonated with that style, where he saw the importance of proving things out experimentally.
Many of the British party got headhunted because they were already doing important, relevant war work. So Geoffrey Taylor, Sir Geoffrey, within a month of visiting Los Alamos, was an internationally renowned fluid dynamicist, and he was already doing war work on air and underwater blast waves. And James Tuck had been working for Churchill's science advisor, Lord Cherwell, and he knew all about shaped explosive charges. Ernest Titterton had been working on radar, and Los Alamos wanted him for electronics work and so on. Taylor was also instrumental in getting William Penny to go to Los Alamos. Penny was another brilliant applied mathematician, also working on blast waves, and of course he later headed up the British independent nuclear weapons program after the war.
Chadwick spent most of his time in Washington with General Groves. Therefore, Rudolf Peierls became the de facto leader of the contingent.
Rudolf Peierls is perhaps one of the unsung heroes of the Manhattan Project. He was born in Germany, studied in Russia, emigrated at the beginning of the war to England to escape Nazi Germany. And while in England, he participated in the early British atomic bomb program. His most important contribution there, which carried over to the United States and the Manhattan Project, was to discover that very small amounts of U-235 were necessary to make an atomic bomb. He subsequently came to the United States as part of the British mission. Here at Los Alamos, Peierls had a very important role. He resonated and worked very well with Oppenheimer. They had exchanged information earlier about bomb projects. But here at Los Alamos in particular, he took over the implosion dynamics group from Edward Teller at the reorganization of the laboratory in 1944, and is largely responsible for bringing Fat Man to fruition, that is the development of the implosion design technique.
Well, I got to know Rudolf Peierls when I was a student in Oxford doing my physics degree. Of course, he was a very senior professor at this point. He was the Wickham Professor of Physics in my college in New College, so we would see him dining on the high table, etc. And in the nuclear physics lab, he was somebody whom the grad students were in tremendous awe of. He was known as the sort of father of the British bomb, and he was knighted after the war for his efforts. Now, why was he the father of the British bomb? Well, of course, he wrote the Peierls and Frisch memorandum that got the whole project going. But in addition, he was a group leader in the theoretical division that helped design the hydrodynamics of the implosion weapon. So he was really famous for that effort too. And in fact, the design of the gadget that involved a solid core of plutonium was really referred to as the Christie gadget, but Peierls also was on the patent for that invention.
A little over half the group was comprised of British subjects. Many others came from across Europe.
Many scientists escaped the rise of the Nazi regime, and so Otto Frisch from Austria, Fuchs and Peierls from Germany, and Plaschek from Czechoslovakia went to United Kingdom. The Manhattan Project was fortunate to benefit from the great scientist mind coming from continental Europe.
Many of the British mission scientists held leadership positions at Los Alamos. Peierls, Frisch, and Plaschek were all group leaders in divisions engaged in designing the implosion bomb, the gadget. Brecher served as a group leader in Enrico Fermi's division, which was tasked with exploring the feasibility of building a thermonuclear weapon. Peierls' brilliant understudy, Klaus Fuchs, served as a section leader in his mentor's theoretical division group. The duo of Peierls and Fuchs was largely responsible for the theoretical design of the implosion bomb. Fuchs, however, was convicted of espionage in 1950. He had made a significant contribution to the design of the American bomb, but arguably an even greater one to Stalin's.
I think it's important to emphasize that Fuchs did great work for us on implosion problems, on the initiator for Fat Man and so on. But yes, even before going to Los Alamos, Fuchs was also working for the Soviet Union. He was a one-man 1940s style nuclear proliferation.
The British mission scientist arrived in the summer of 1944, just as director J. Robert Oppenheimer was reorganizing his laboratory to build the implosion weapon. In addition to the contributions by Peierls, Fuchs, and Placek, several others played important roles in the gadget's development. James Tuck played a critical role in designing the shaped charges that drove the implosion of the gadget. Ernest Titterton designed many of the bomb's electrical systems.
Fat Man, what we know as the gadget, was a very, very unique apparatus. It was the first time in the world that thousands and thousands of pounds of high explosives were used in a very precise fashion. And that precise fashion was to have it symmetrically crush a ball of plutonium into a supercritical state.
At 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the gadget was successfully tested in the desert of south-central New Mexico, unleashing the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. Jeffrey Taylor made many technical predictions pertaining to the test, including the formation of its iconic mushroom cloud. William Penny, one of the world's leading experts on blast phenomena, helped diagnose the yield of Trinity.
The design of the gadget had gone through a revolution in 1944, where the lab pivoted to develop an implosion mechanism with plutonium. A number of scientists played tremendously important roles in that, from experimental to theory. Neddermeyer was one of the key inventors of the concept. Kistiakowsky helped develop the high explosive part of the problem. The importance of simultaneity in the exploding detonators, these big bridge wire detonators, was essential for the project. It was understood early on that instabilities could be a problem during the compression, and there were scientists from Britain, G.I. Taylor, who was the leading instability hydrodynamics theorist, who helped work through those kind of problems, as well as Klaus Fuchs, who was part of the hydrodynamic modeling group as well, working for Peierls. Experimental work was also critical for optimizing that implosion. Many different complementary methods were used to diagnose the implosion mechanism. A couple of them are particularly noteworthy. One of them was called RALA, radioactive lanthanum, where a very hot radioactive source was put in the middle of the imploding system. And by looking at the gamma rays screaming out from that source and measuring them on detectors as the implosion occurred, they could check the symmetry and optimize the symmetry of the implosion. And in fact, that also even led to design changes to make sure that they could get the compressibility right of the plutonium. There was another remarkable part of this whole implosion project, which was the Bethe-Peierls formula. This was a theoretical formula that had been developed to estimate the yield of a fission weapon, and by putting in certain details on the physics of that implosion mechanism, one could estimate the yield of the device. And that led to bets before the explosion at Trinity of what the yield would be. In fact, they were all very, very low. Trinity outsurpassed every expectation.
The Trinity test was one of the great scientific experiments of all time, but it was also the test of a revolutionary new weapon about to enter combat. Nazi Germany had been defeated by conventional means at awful cost, but Imperial Japan continued to fight on in the Pacific. President Truman warned the Japanese government that they would face prompt and utter destruction if they did not surrender unconditionally. It was a warning the Japanese government chose to ignore. Thus, nuclear weapons were prepared for combat. Penny sat on the Target Committee, which was responsible for selecting Japanese cities for atomic bombing. He also served as a technical consultant on the island of Tinian. Tinian was the home of the 509th Composite Bombing Force. which would strike Japan in the days ahead. On August 6th, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima. Late in the evening of August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. In the opening hours of August 9th, the Red Army invaded Manchuria, killing 84,000 Japanese soldiers in the brief campaign that ensued. Hours later, Fat Man was unleashed against Nagasaki. William Penny, who participated in the mission, witnessed the destruction of the city far below.
Because of his experience working with the British Air Ministry, Penny was asked by General Groves to sit on the target committee that planned the actual bombings against Japan. And Penny did the sums on height of burst in particular, how to maximize the blast damage and how to keep the delivery aircraft safe. After the war, Penny was also one of those sent to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to assess the effects of the bombings, and his particular insight was to adopt really simple practical measures of blast, like what happened to petrol cans and metal posts, things that had a uniform design and were scattered widely over the cities. And so Penny probably came up with the most reliable estimate of the yields of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs.
When we met at Wendover for the first time about 10 months ago, I told you at that time that I had great hopes that the mission that we were about to undertake could end the war.
On August 14th, 1945, Imperial Japan surrendered unconditionally.
In the summer of 1945, the United States was fighting some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, including those for the Philippines and most importantly for Okinawa. And yet Japan, after losing these battles, seemed no nearer to surrender than it did before. And in fact, the United States then had to start planning for the invasion of Japan. There seemed to be no end in sight for the war. And so when the atomic bombs were used, the Emperor of Japan decided that he had to bear the unbearable, as he said, and ordered that Japan surrender.
World War II had claimed 60 to 80 million lives worldwide. But with the slaughter over, the wives of the British mission scientists organized a celebration at Los Alamos. A traditional British feast of soup, steak and kidney pie, and trifle was served, along with whiskey, brandy, and port wine for toasting the success of the Grand Alliance. Tuck helped complete the memorable evening. He wrote a play based on wartime Los Alamos, which was performed by the British contingent. The mood quickly dampened, however, as the perils of the new atomic age loomed. Many British scientists called for international control of atomic energy. Meanwhile, the United States Congress passed legislation outlawing the exchange of classified information with foreign countries, all foreign countries including the UK. Again, the partnership had come to an abrupt end.
The Atomic Energy Act wasn't specifically anti-British. It was all about the fight for control between civilians and the military in the United States and the effect that would have on academic and commercial freedom. And the British were the collateral damage. The bill was passing through Congress at just the same time as a huge loan of $4.5 billion to the UK, which was pretty unpopular, and the first of the atom spy cases was just breaking too. So amendments got introduced to criminalize passing atomic secrets to any other country, including Canada and the UK.
As the United States improved existing weapons, the UK quietly resumed its independent weapons program behind the leadership of William Penny. After the successful October 1952 test of Britain's first atomic bomb, Penny was made Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire. In 1958, the year after the British independently developed a hydrogen bomb, the US and UK signed the Mutual Defense Agreement. This formally re-established the wartime partnership. The relationship endures to this day.
Today, the Mutual Defense Agreement permits the exchange of nuclear science, technology, equipment, and materials. The collaboration involves each of the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration laboratories and production sites and the United Kingdom's Atomic Weapons Establishment. Our cooperation under the MDA has contributed to the sustainment and overall credibility of our independent nuclear deterrence, and it will continue to do so for many, many more years to come.
Our cooperation under the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement has been the longest running collaboration between two nations. From its beginnings, the respective scientists and engineers working on their national weapons programs have offered peer review to each other, demonstrating that physics doesn't change as you cross the Atlantic. I am sure our collaboration under the MDA will continue to thrive and grow and benefit the UK and US as we go forward.
People often talk about the Manhattan Project as being the beginnings of big science. And by big science, people refer to the kind of major projects that happen today that involve thousands of scientists to be successful. Los Alamos has benefited from many foreigners coming to this lab, doing wonderful research, many rising into senior positions, and the lab is a better place for that.
I cannot escape the feeling that without active and continuing British interest, there probably would have been no atomic bomb to drop on Hiroshima. General Leslie Groves.
The more effective will be the deterrence against a third world war. If I may say this, members of the Congress, be careful above all things, therefore, not to let go of the atomic weapon until you are sure, and more than sure, that other means of preserving peace are in your hands.
And so I think the real contribution of the British mission scientists, was how well they integrated themselves into the bomb project here at Los Alamos, how they contributed to the team effort that was necessary to produce both Fat Man and Little Boy.
The Manhattan Project was a first international scientific success, and to this day we are continuing on international collaboration for scientific discovery.
The US-UK partnership, forged during the deadliest conflict of all time, changed history. Today, the special relationship between the two countries ensures the nuclear deterrent remains safe and reliable. It's a very dangerous world, but a world made more secure and stable by the combined efforts of British and American scientists. Scientists who were inspired by their predecessors, who collaborated to bring a terrible war to an abrupt and victorious end.